Buck 86. Boxing's biggest names, biggest stories, biggest fights, greatest memories and moments. Simply put, and I wrote this down. Boxing's best podcast for the deep sea divers of the sweet science. And one reason we can go to those depths others can't get to, hopefully not the abyss, is because of Lee Groves. He is a boxing writer, author, CompuBox counter, and a historian. How you doing, Lee?
Doing well. How about yourself?
Pretty good, pretty good. Excited about this one. I've been saying that word a lot lately. That's good when you get
Yeah.
my age, that you can have a little bit of excitement. And it's because of our guests, extra guests. We're usually, we usually just have one at a time, although at times we have panels. But this one is special because...
Well, because of the depth of experience that's going to be between the four of us. We did the math and we came up with about 150 years of professional experience when it comes to boxing. And our guests today are Eric Raskin and Kieran Mulvaney, and both have a lot of credentials attached to them. Eric has been in boxing journalism for nearly 30 years, and during that time, he covered the sport for outlets like Boxing Scene, ESPN, Grantland, Playboy, and The Ring, where he served as a managing editor for 7 years. He has also co-hosted podcasts for HBO and Showtime, as well as Ring Theory and the Interim Champion Boxing podcast. He has won 3 first-place writing awards from the Boxing Writers Association of America. And outside of boxing, he wrote the 2014 book, The Moneymaker Effect, and is the senior editor of Casino Reports. And as far as Kieran is concerned, he's a native of England. He is a true globetrotter. He has lived in Alaska, Virginia, Vermont, and has spent considerable time in Antarctica. He came to boxing from the world of environmental activism, and in 2003, he traveled to Las Vegas in the hopes of writing a book about a subject that was 180 degrees opposite of what he'd been doing, boxing. Now, while the book never got past the talking stages, he eventually became a freelance writer for ESPN and Reuters. After that, he wrote blogs and filmed videos for HBO, and he co-hosted podcasts with Eric Raskin for HBO and then Showtime. Those podcasts ended when HBO and Showtime left boxing, and so did his time covering boxing in general. He has since returned to his environmental roots by writing articles and blogs as well as books, the most recent of which was released last year. Today we'll talk with them about how they got into boxing, what has changed during their time covering the sport, how they see it now, and where they think the sport goes from here.
All right. Well, Lee's here. I'm here. Mulvaney and Raskin will be here right after this. Back in this corner of the podcast, a buck 86. We've got some good stuff to go on. We're going to, as I mentioned in the intro, we're going to dig deep. I hope we don't go all the way to the abyss, but you're talking about 150 plus years of pugilistic experience between the four of us on this screen right now. Unfortunately, I'm the old guy of the crew, but anyway, a lot of makeup, steroids, and deer antler, and here I am. We might talk to Kieran about deer antler a little bit later on, but I'm going to do with you guys what I do with everybody, whether it's on my television show or on the podcast. We'll start with you, Kieran. When did the boxing bug bite Kieran Mulvaney, and how?
When I was a kid in England, I remember listening to the radio way past my bedtime. My first memory is when Alan Minter fought Vito Antuofermo the second time, I think. And I remember listening to Vito was a bleeder, and as was indeed Alan Minter. But in this occasion, like Minter managed to carve Vito Antuofermo up, and I remember kind of listening under the covers to this fight and Minter winning. I thought, oh, that was kind of exciting. And of course, fights being in the US were even later at night in the UK, which gave me even more of a reason to stay up. So I remember listening to that. I remember listening to Frank Bruno lose to Tim Witherspoon. And there was just, I don't know what it was about boxing that I enjoyed, but there was just definitely something about that experience of sitting down and watching fights. And at the time I was getting into it, there were a couple of other fighters in the UK. As I started to get interested was during Barry McGuigan's sort of rise, and that really did a tremendous job for popularity of boxing in the UK. So it would have been probably when I was about 8 or 9 or 10, 50 or so years ago.
What was your first job in boxing, your first paid gig?
My first paid gig was as a columnist for ESPN, I think. So I had decided, so in 2003, I was living in Alaska. I'd written a couple of books. I'd come into some money through some dubious project.
A lot of people in Alaska come into money, but that's another story. But go ahead.
That's a whole other story. And I'd, as well as being into boxing, as a kid, I used to be into this detective show called Vegas, starring Robert Urich, right? And he drove around Las Vegas in a Ford Thunderbird convertible. I'm like, oh, I want to do that. That sounds like a larf. And so I decided to take myself off to Vegas, rent a convertible, drive around the town, and find people to interview about boxing. I had this idea of writing a book about boxing in Las Vegas, and I was going to specifically focus on guys holding the spit bucket, or judges, or just people who weren't necessarily in the spotlight. And so I took myself down to Vegas to do that, and spent several months in Vegas, and wrote a very extensive proposal. And my agent sent it to about 20 publishers, 19 of whom came back and said, this is great, but boxing fans don't buy books. And the other one said, this is terrible. So I put all this effort into this for absolutely nothing. I'm like, what on earth am I going to do? And then a mutual friend of all of ours, I'm sure, Rachel Charles, was then a publicist for Goosen, said, hey, ESPN's looking for a freelance writer. Are you interested? And I'm like, well, yeah, I just sunk all this money into writing this book that nobody wants to read. So yes, I better. And then I started freelancing for ESPN. Then I was sitting ringside for a fight. And Fred Sternberg sat next to me and said, Reuters is looking for a stringer. Are you interested? And I said, yes, absolutely. And then it went from there. And then I ended up having drinks with Bert Sugar frequently. And HBO producers saw me. And, well, there you go.
All right. Well, I like that. So, Raskin, same question. How the hell did you get into boxing in your first paid gig? And I know it had nothing to do with Alaska, but go ahead.
I've never been to Alaska. Had nothing to do with that. So the order is exactly reversed for me. I had my first paid gig before the sport, before the bug bit me, or I got bit by the bug, or however that works. I graduated from college with a degree in mathematical economics that I had no interest in using because I wanted to go into sports journalism. And I moved back home, moved in with my parents, looking for jobs. My dad was even more motivated to find me a job than I was to find myself a job, and he found in the newspaper, I lived in the Philadelphia suburbs, he found in the newspaper, looking for an editor, a sports magazine, that was like 20 minutes from my parents' house. Turns out this little magazine called Ring Magazine was in the Philly suburbs, not far from where I lived. And I, at the time, knew very little about boxing. I knew Mike Tyson. This was 1997. I knew Mike Tyson, Evander Holyfield, the name Oscar De La Hoya, but I couldn't tell you much about him. I really was not a big boxing fan at all. I was a huge pro wrestling fan growing up. And this was the company that made Pro Wrestling Illustrated, which was like the first magazine I ever subscribed to myself. So I was all excited when I got this interview. What happened was Steve Farhood and Eric Karabell both left at the same time. So the Ring, an editorial staff of 3, was suddenly down to 1, Nigel Collins, and they needed to hire someone fast. And knowledge of boxing was not necessarily a prerequisite. If you could write and you could edit, you could learn about boxing. So I went to this interview, and in my mind, I'm thinking, oh, this is great. I don't care about boxing, but the wrestling guys are right there. Maybe I'll be able to make a lateral move at some point. And in any case, the interview went well. They offered me the job. I took it with that sort of thought process. A month into the job, I went to my first fight. Main event: Lennox Lewis, Andrew Galata in Atlantic City. Nothing that would get one hooked there. But the co-feature, Arturo Gatti, Gabe Ruelas. And so I'm at my first fight, and I see an absolute incredible come from behind, one punch, left hook knockout from Gatti, and I'm instantly hooked. So yeah, I had a paid gig in boxing about a month before I would say I really became a boxing fan.
Lee, I'll call my good friend Diamond Dallas Page and tell him that Eric loves wrestling too.
As long as he doesn't hit me with a diamond cutter.
Yeah, I actually got him into wrestling. That's a whole nother story. But go ahead, Lee.
Well, in the introduction, we mentioned that the two of you were co-hosts of a podcast, actually a few podcasts. How did the podcast come about?
You wanna take it, Kieran?
Well, my understanding is actually it kind of originated with you, because I was starting to do work I'd been hired by HBO to do digital reporting on camera and write for the website. But Eric had been talking to our editor, Michael Gluckstadt, about doing a podcast, first of all, right? And I got, sucked into that with you, really. But the idea was yours, as I recall.
I can tell how thrilled you were.
Yeah, he got sucked into it. Yeah, wow, poor guy. So my first podcast was Ring Theory with Bill Detloff. We started that in 2009. And after we'd been doing that for a couple of years, and I was writing for HBO on the side, it was even before Gluckstadt. It was a different editor there that I had mentioned, hey, maybe we could do a podcast for you guys. And it was sort of bandied about. And then it wasn't until 2014 when Kieran was doing a lot of writing for HBO. I was doing a little bit of writing for HBO. And we did a couple of things where we were at the same fight, and in the press room we did like these back and forth WhatsApp messaging, whatever it was, sending messages back and forth to write a two-person column, and there was like a little bit of a chemistry there, and so the editor, I think, picked up on that, and so then it kind of came back around. I continued to bug them about a podcast, and they said, well, we don't want Detloff, but Raskin and Mulvaney, why don't we try the two of you? And so that was how our first podcast was the HBO Boxing podcast that started in 2014.
So you've been at it, you were probably one of the earlier entries into the podcast world. So you're probably qualified to answer this particular question. How has the podcasting world evolved since the time you started to where it is now?
Do we have an explosion? Do we have any special effect? Go ahead.
Right. I mean, yeah, back then you couldn't just say everyone has a podcast. Now there's something wrong with you if you don't have a pod. Although we don't currently have a podcast, so I guess there's something wrong with us.
Well, but that's never been an issue, has it?
But yeah, I mean, I think it was definitely a case when we certainly when I started Ring Theory, but even when we started the HBO podcast, that there were only a handful of boxing podcasts out there, and now, I mean, there's certainly a lot more competition in the field, and some of them have become a lot more specialized. I'd say that's the thing that I've noticed that's changed the most is, yes, there are a lot of weekly news coverage, interviews, etc., but there are also some out there that are doing some interesting things, not to like plug a competitor of yours or a fellow podcast or whatever, but like just something that comes to the top of my mind is the new Desert Island Fights podcast that Steve Hunt is doing that I appeared as a guest on. That's a podcast that it has a specific theme. Name your 5 desert island fights, and we'll take the discussion from there. So I think it's gone in some interesting directions as more and more podcasts have come along to create this sort of competition where you got to do something a little different to stand out.
How about you, Kieran? What differences have you seen in the podcast world?
Well, I'm not a consumer of podcasts, interestingly.
You'll live a longer, healthier life that way. But go ahead.
Yeah, what I now need to do is just completely shed my addiction to my phone and other devices entirely, which is a whole other thing, of course.
Well, when you're running from polar bears, what the? We'll get into that
Well,
later.
yeah, exactly. I actually know of somebody who actually was able to save themselves from a polar bear with a phone, but that's another story. So I'm not that much of a consumer, other than I'm aware of more people having podcasts, and it did. Before we did the HBO one, I had one on ESPN, and I can't remember when I started that. I'm not still doing that, by the way, in case we have any readers. That's a little running joke Eric and I have.
Yes.
That people would write in and say, "Gosh, really big fan of yours, but I haven't heard your ESPN podcast for a while." Well, that's because I stopped it 10 years ago. But for about 6 or 7 years, I think, was it that long? ESPN had me doing and it was just me sitting in front of a microphone, just being very sort of, Andy Rooney-ish, just groaning on about what was wrong with boxing for 20 minutes or something like that, and that was very unusual, I think, at the time. That was really sort of cutting edge. And yeah, now everybody has a podcast, and I'm aware of the fact that everybody has a podcast, but not everyone can actually do a podcast, right? It's not just, you've got to have some kind of personality. You've got to be you can't just, doesn't even matter how much you know about your subject. If you just sit there and there's a lot of dead air and sort of lack of variety in your pitch and your speech, it's not going to be a very good podcast. Some people can do it, some people can. Everyone tries, I guess.
That's a great point. The producer of my television show, In This Corner, John Hyatt, used to always say, everybody thinks they can do television. Everybody wants to do television, but not everybody belongs on television or podcasting. Lee, go back to your stuff.
Did you guys have any particular favorite guests over the years?
Yeah, I would say so. I'll go first, because I know the one that comes right to mind that was a favorite of ours on HBO, and then we had him on Showtime a handful of times as well. Roy Jones was just an absolute favorite podcast guest of ours. We mostly interviewed him in person when we did like radio rows for fights. Maybe we did him over the phone or Zoom or whatever once or twice, but it was mostly in person. And just every time you're kind of like, what Roy are we going to get? Is he going to be interested? Is he going to be into it? And without fail, within a question or two, something would get him animated. And before you knew it, he was just dazzling us again with some. The one that really stands out is when he started going into this, telling us which fighters did and did not have a full toolbox, and he's just like listing names like Vasily Lomachenko, full toolbox, and this person not, and he was so into it, and we were, and so yeah, Roy is the first name that comes to mind. We, especially doing the Showtime one, we got to interview a lot of up and coming and active fighters, and in a 20-minute span, fell in love with a bunch of them as well. But Roy is the first one who comes to mind for me.
How about you?
And I'll also do a shout out for Mr. Gary Russell Jr., who, again, in both incarnations we had on a couple of times, and I have become just a real fan of those brothers, and really enjoy like encountering them. They are, as I'm sure you guys know, I'm sure you've dealt with them, the nicest people. And Gary Russell Jr., he was always just a great interview. And there was one in particular where we were using Skype quite a lot for our interviews. And whenever somebody was on a phone and we were using Skype, we were having real connection issues. And I don't know, probably about 4 or 5 times we were doing this interview with Gary Russell Jr., and 4 or 5 times it dropped out. And each time we called back, he picked right back up, continued on with his answer right where he had been when it dropped out, never complained, never just picked it right back up. Whereas once, and I don't blame Andy Ruiz Jr. for this whatsoever. In contrast, like we did one with Andy Ruiz, dropped out twice, and he wouldn't even pick up the phone again. But Gary Russell Jr. just unfailingly polite and super interested in answering questions, and an interesting guy. I always loved it when we had Gary Russell on.
Well, Eric, last year you wrote an article for Boxing Scene describing how boxing journalism has changed since the late 1990s. Can you describe those changes, and do you characterize them as good, bad, or something in between?
Probably the short answer would be something in between, or a lot from column A and a lot from column B. I can't remember exactly what I covered in that particular article. I haven't looked at it recently. But the biggest things for me that really stand out are the technology involved with how we get our information. That when I first started at Boxing Scene, I did like a 2 article series of what it was like covering boxing before BoxRec versus now, and what it was like covering boxing before YouTube versus now. And we're in this place, I'm sure you guys can attest to this as well. It's hard to remember how we ever got anything done without BoxRec at our fingertips and YouTube to be able to look up every fight clip that we need to see at any given time. So that's one particular way in which it's changed. The other thing that stands out is just sort of within the field of journalism and within the business of boxing. When I first started, we didn't have conflicts of interest at the ring. We were owned by a publishing company and not by a promoter. And this is not just specific to things that have changed at the ring. This is everywhere. If you want to work in this business, it is very hard to do it without getting a paycheck from somebody who also televises boxing or has some other connection to it as a promoter, and so forth. And that was true at, we were podcasting for HBO. We were podcasting for Showtime. We were not entirely impartial. We tried to be. I don't think that we were like dishonest with our audience, but it's not quite independent journalism. And there hardly is any independent journalism left in boxing. At this point, almost everyone has some degree of conflict of interest if they're still getting paid to cover the sport.
Right. And Kieran, you came to boxing from the world of activism. And activists by nature want to bring about positive change. After having spent considerable time in the boxing world, do you think that boxing as a whole is capable of producing positive changes? And do you think that those who control the sport even want to make any changes?
Let's take the second part first. No, not particularly. And the first part is a really interesting question, Lee, and as I'm sure we all have, I've thought about it quite a lot, particularly lately, as I'm not very much involved in boxing, since Eric and I stopped our podcast, and sort of I've been able to take a step back. It's such a zero-sum game, boxing, right? Whatever role you have in boxing, you feel that if somebody else who is in a similar role is benefiting in some way, you're not. There's a strong institutional disincentive toward being collaborative, toward being helpful, toward looking for the future, toward being a nice person. The way in which boxing works, and maybe it's because of something fundamental about the sport, right? That the sport is based on and earns money on and survives people getting their brains turned to mush. And maybe that attracts, present company accepted, of course, a certain type of person. And maybe it just attracts a certain kind of setup that if that's what you're into and you're like, I'm going to make buck out of this, there's just not that incentive to, well, why do I want to make sure that boxers are paid properly? They're gonna be done in 10 years anyway. Why do I need to worry about the ones coming up? Why do I need to care about their welfare? Because once they start to walk on their heels, they're done to me anyway. I don't need them anymore. And I do wonder if just the very nature of the way it is established, it's very, very hard. There's just not the interest, the motivation among many of the parties involved in boxing to change it in such a way that it's a more humane and pleasurable place to be around, better for the athletes, better for those who are otherwise involved in it. It feels as if many of those in boxing have reasons to actively oppose ways that boxing could be run better.
As Morgan Freeman said so many times in $1 Million Baby, everything in boxing is backwards. And on those sobering words, we will take a break. We will come back with more in this corner, the podcast. Eric Raskin, Kieran Mulvaney, Lee Groves, they're in friendly West Virginia. No polar bears there, but they have other critters running around. I'm hanging out in Las Vegas where we got 4 or 5 coyotes and a lot of cougars. Don't take that the wrong way. We'll be back. Back on In This Corner, the podcast. Great guest they have already been, will continue to be, Mulvaney and Raskin. You know, when all of us got into it, the criteria was so different. The resume and qualifications were so much deeper than today. We might not all have gone to broadcast school or were an ex-fighter and did it the way I did it or the way Lee Groves have done it and you guys have done it, but it's just so different than it was, and I'm not going to vacillate. I'm not given to ambiguity or ambivalence. It most of it, a lot of it sucks, and a part of the reason why, and I hate to say this because I do consider it at its best a sweet science. I do think fighters are the most common and uncommon of all athletes, but I think boxing has drifted from being a sport to an event. Lee?
Yeah, that's true. Do you guys agree with that assessment?
I think. I mean, I would not call it a sport still. But has it become more about the entertainment value and trying to put on a show and less about the athletic skill? I think certainly that's something that if you sit back and watch the old time fights, you will see a level of craft that you just don't see as frequently anymore. And I think a lot of that is simply due to the fact that if you fight 50 times by the time you're 25, you're going to develop into a different kind of fighter than if you've fought 12 times by the time you're 25. The schedules they kept required and created a different level of craft. So in that regard, I guess you can say that the sport element has diminished, but it nevertheless is still two guys or gals in the ring athletically trying to overcome one another. So it is still very much a sport, but do the promoters, in certain cases, view it more as, I'm trying to put on a show here, we're trying to do what's most entertaining, I'm trying to advance my fighter, versus what I care about most is giving the customers a competitive, exciting product. I think that's been diminished somewhat. And so, still a sport, also an event, maybe a little less of a skill-based sport than it once was, would be my answer to that.
And
Yeah, and I think you only have to look at the popularity of these influencer boxing events to realize that there's perhaps more of boxing fandom now that actually isn't necessarily that into the boxing, right? They're not looking for that nuance. They couldn't care about the nuance. They couldn't care about who's a good boxer and who isn't necessarily. They just want to see people flail at each other and someone get knocked out. And I'm really cognizant that I am very much approaching the old man shouts at cloud part of my life, and so
approaching.
Well, there you go.
Hey, be careful, Eric. I'm way older than all of you guys.
But it's not just about age. I mean, I have watched Kieran literally look up in the sky and start shouting at clouds, and that started like 10 years ago.
Exactly. And it was nighttime, and the sky was clear.
Well, it's always nighttime in the Antarctic.
Except when it isn't.
Yeah.
But yeah, so I think the fan base has shifted a little bit in that respect, and I think part of that, and I'm sure we've all bemoaned this, stems from the days where you could get to know boxers because we had shows like USA Tuesday Night Fights and things like, you could get to know boxers as they were coming up, and I think there's probably less of that. Many people only become aware of boxers when they are big stars, and that's when they want to watch them, and that's when they put on the big events, and they don't necessarily particularly care about the skill of the boxing, and they're mostly interested in, quote, making some noise and other such. See, I told you about the yelling at clouds stuff. And so, yeah, I think the fan base has shifted, and I think this reflects. It's not just boxing, right? It's about sports consumption. It's about media consumption. There are just changes in all of that, and boxing, I think, sort of in the way that it has lower barriers of entry for journalism. So we see some of these changes in boxing perhaps before some of the rest of sports journalism. So with fandom, it's relatively easy to buy into being a boxing fan. And so I think we see some of these changes in boxing maybe a little bit before some of the rest of sports. But I think a lot of the rest of sports and a lot of the rest of entertainment consumption is going a similar way, really.
Yeah. Boxing has always had sideshow aspects to it.
Right.
But in recent years, we have witnessed a rash of exhibitions and real fights involving elderly former fighters. We're going to have one in September with Mayweather and Pacquiao. We've seen a flood of matches involving social media influencers and entire leagues that have implemented a twisting of the rules, such as Team Combat League. And unlike other eras in which these kinds of fights come and go, it looks like they're here to stay. Some say that's good because they expose the sport to a new generation of eyes, while others say that they're doing irreparable harm to a sport that boasts such a rich history. Which side of the fence do each of you occupy? And let's start with Eric.
I think that my position on this has migrated a bit. Let's just use Jake Paul as the example here. That he's obviously
there goes my stomach, but go ahead.
He's obviously the influencer who entered boxing, who has come the farthest and made the biggest splash. And up to a point, I did think he was somewhat good for boxing, that he was bringing new eyeballs to the sport, and he certainly has been good for women's boxing in terms of getting Amanda Serrano and Katie Taylor and others in front of larger audiences to show what they can do. And so I at first I sort of felt like, yes, he's a sideshow, but he's using it for something productive for the rest of the sport and creating new boxing fans, and I was kind of on board with all that. And as it's continued to go along, and he's increasingly engaged in fights that are just like embarrassing messes, whether it's beating up a 60-year-old almost Mike Tyson or getting beaten up by Anthony Joshua, that either way, it has passed that point where the sport exceeds the event, to go back to what Smitty was saying before, that now it is doing more harm than good, I believe. I think as a fighter, Jake Paul has now played out the string, and I've lost all interest in whatever he is going to do as a fighter, whereas a couple of years ago I was willing to say, yeah, okay, I'm interested to see where he goes with this and whether he can progress toward being some sort of a fringe contender. We're past that point where he deserves to be taken seriously at all, where his career interests me at all. As a promoter of real boxers, I'll continue to be interested in what Jake Paul does. But yeah, as these sideshow events get farther off the side, and whether it's the Mayweather-Pacquiao event that may or may not be a real fight, may or may not be an exhibition, may or may not happen, nobody seems to know, from that to the Mike Tyson nonsense to all of it, it has gotten to a point where I believe it's doing more damage to the sport than good at this point.
I call it the dumbing down of boxing, the degradation of boxing. When I launched my television show In This Corner, which somehow is still on the air after 22 years, I haven't gotten a check for it in several years, but it's still on DirecTV. My whole thing was because I was just a 4-round little club fighter, and I've been in the ring with 65 world champions, where from Roy Jones to Mike Tyson to everybody I've been in the ring with, and it was all about showcasing their great skill and what made them different as human beings. And both of you guys have done that with your writing and your broadcasting. And again, I never bought in to the Jake Paul thing, because I just think it's a perfect storm for ignorance that we had all of these writers, so-called writers and broadcasters, where the qualifications is just having a frickin' phone. And then you get a guy like a Jake Paul, and there are people that stop me in the airports even, and they call Jake Paul like a real fighter. And then he, rather than be humble and say, I'm so thrilled that I'm allowed to do this, he'll challenge a Canelo Alvarez, which then again depreciates. I'm sorry, I'm now doing the Kieran stuff, but that's and for me, but you know what? In a couple of months, I'll be hosting the International Boxing Hall of Fame with legends on the wall like Sugar Ray Robinson and great fighters there. So I'm at the point in my career where it's okay. But for people coming up that want to be Kieran, that want to be Eric, that want to be Lee, they're screwed.
Well, what are your thoughts, Kieran, about the Jake Paul phenomenon and the sideshow aspects?
Well, and I had a similar arc to Eric, because we went through it together on our podcast, honestly, and I'm right where he is too. I think what's interesting, and our mutual friend Brian Graham had a really interesting column about this for The Guardian after the Anthony Joshua Jake Paul thing, which is that, like, I watched it thinking, well, how can Jake seriously still kind of try to pretend that he is what he isn't, after having his jaw, separated from his skull. And Brian pointed out that you were kind of missing the point with these influencer boxings. It's not about winning or losing. It's about the clicks, right? It's just different. And that kind of gets back, Smitty, to your earlier point about it being more like event than sport. It's about, what does it matter? It doesn't. So I got my jaw broke. Did you see how many clicks I got? Did you see how much attention I got? I'm on SportsCenter. It's fantastic. And that just changes the whole nature of a sport that's tremendous. I think my biggest concern that I have with all of this influencer stuff, boxing's super freaking dangerous. It's not just a sport, right? It's unbelievably dangerous. Very, very, very good boxers get badly hurt or killed in the ring. And now you've got these knuckleheads who are largely fighting other knuckleheads and deserve a ton of credit. Anybody who gets into any condition to get into a ring and compete with somebody else in a ring deserves a ton of credit. But that doesn't mean, because you're a knucklehead who's done this and it's great for you, that you should be representative of the sport, or you should be having these big fights, because someone's going to get hurt. Someone's going to get really, really, really badly hurt. And that's going to have repercussions, I think, when somebody famous, like your favorite soap opera actor or your favorite singer or some washed up kind of celeb from the 70s has some kind of a celebrity boxing event or some influence, and they die. And that's going to happen, or they're going to get badly hurt. And then everyone who says, well, this is great for boxing, we're then going to have to deal with the backlash. And that's my big thing with all of this. It's like, there isn't a barrier to entry to boxing. There's never been a barrier to entry to boxing. There've always been bad boxers. There've always been sideshows. The whole thing's always been kind of ridiculous. But let's not make it any more dangerous than it already is. To get back to your original question, Lee, like, we're trying to make this a better place, not worse. And this is, I think, making it worse. Because, and again, as part of the whole media environment, which is part of a broader media environment, critical media is being sidelined because those involved, be they promoters, be they fighters, be they whoever, now realize in the modern media environment, you don't need gatekeepers. You can just talk directly to your fans. You have your own people following you around with a phone, and you can say whatever you want and do whatever you want and be filmed doing that without ever having to have awkward people like the four of us ask difficult questions that people don't want to answer. And so I think that kind of spiral is making it potentially a lot more dangerous.
And I think there's been a lot of reputational damage to boxing that is deserved, by the way. Boxing brought this on itself, but not just that, there is that low barrier to entry, but then when a Jake Paul is able to make his events some of the biggest events in boxing, it announces to the world that this sport is a joke, even though we know that 98% of the fights that are out there are serious. But these are the ones getting the attention. The fact that boxing was susceptible to being taken over to whatever extent by a Jake Paul really speaks ill of boxing. And so when you hear that the boxing is dead, boxing is dying cliche that I know we all can't stand it, we've heard it a million times, but that when you see a Jake Paul versus Anthony Joshua or a Jake Paul versus Mike Tyson getting more attention than a Boots Ennis versus Xander Zayas by, a magnitude of 100 times, it definitely communicates to the public that this is not a sport to be taken seriously, even if we all know that there's a lot about it that should still be taken seriously.
Yeah, a lot of it gets into, I used to say, even back when I was doing radio in the 80s, I used to say whatever goes on in sport, whatever goes on in society will permeate into sport. And that's what's certainly football, basketball, baseball, hockey, other sports. But you're not going to, Jake Paul's not going to get into the National Football League.
Right.
He's not going to get into baseball or hockey or anything like that. And the effect, and I now I really sound like Howard Cosell, the old one. A kid like Ryan Garcia, I hope that's the only time I say his name on this, because I won't have him on the show. And I know he's a legitimate kind of fighter, but I can tell the reason he'll never be on In This Corner, the TV show, or he'll never be in the Hall of Fame in Canastota, is because he really truly does care more about the hits that he gets online than the hits that he does inside the squared circle, as I flip it back to Lee.
We discussed Jake Paul, but two other men who have made a real big splash in the sport in recent years is Turki Alalsheikh and Dana White. What do you make of their presence in the sport, and do you see them as positive forces or negative forces, or somewhere in between? Start with Eric.
This one I don't have to go as much in between, and I will say I'm not going to say they bring nothing positive in that certainly Turki Alalsheikh's the funding behind him has helped allow some great fights to happen. That would be the positive, but for the most part, I think they are negative forces in the sport. I think that Dana White has his eye on a monopoly in boxing if he can figure out how to make it happen, and certainly getting the legislation passed that he's trying to get passed because he has friends in the right places would be a step toward turning boxing into something closer to what he has going in UFC, where he gets to call all the shots and keep as much of the money as he wants. And I think that's a monopoly in almost any aspect of any business is bad for the consumer. And I think that the boxing world would find out that it's bad here as well if it comes to pass. Turki Alalsheikh is a whole nother set of problems. Just I don't know that we need to get into a deep political discussion.
He's in this for the love of boxing, for the love of the sport.
Well, I do get the sense that he is a boxing fan. I'll give him that. I think that his passion for boxing is probably legitimate, but sports washing, all the human rights injustices, we can throw all those terms out there. That's all part of the package with them getting involved. And I think, probably the article that I wrote last year that got more attention than any other was my deep dive into both them banning independent media such as Boxing Scene from being ringside for any of their shows, and them slowly sinking their claws into the editorial product that they own. And that's not I know that Lee is associated with the ring, and it doesn't mean everything there is compromised, but they're trying to compromise what they can, I guess. Let's put it that way. And especially on the website, I think we've seen more evidence than in print. So from a media perspective, I have my problems with what Turki Alalsheikh is doing. I think his money has been good in the short term for the sport and the fans in certain ways. But we've seen that a million times before. Someone comes in, spends big, bleeds things dry a little bit, backs out, and then we're all left holding the bag.
Eric does such a good job with the diplomacy. Gosh, I got to study that. If only I could do that diplomacy stuff as well as he does it. Go ahead, guys.
I like to tap dance a little bit and try.
You're moving like Willie Pep, baby.
You have
to
any
the young
moves,
kids
Kieran?
out there, to the young, Willie Pep was a great fighter, kind of like this guy. You can look him up. He's no Floyd Mayweather but anyway, I'm kidding.
Any thoughts, Kieran, on those two men?
I mean, I feel exactly the same as Eric. I think that, look, I think we probably all do have broader looks at life than obviously boxing is important to all of us, but I think we all recognize that there are more important things in the world. And Eric and I were both approached by the Saudis to see if we were interested in working with them. We were not, and we didn't even reply to them. I think particularly as a journalist, it's troubling when you have people like this involved in your business, in your sport, and I think it's really even more troubling to just see people just run over each other to try to get part of that handout. And as we're already starting to see, it looks as if Saudi authorities are starting to pull back their investment in some of the sports that they've already tried to hijack. Seen it in golf, seeing it in snooker now, and I think maybe soccer. And I wouldn't be surprised if we see it in boxing. And then where are we going to be? Because it's not like any of these people are trying to build up the infrastructure of the sport. They're not trying to make it a more self-sustaining enterprise. They're not attempting to build up and-coming boxers and make sure that up-and-coming boxers are better paid and looked after better. They really cared about boxing. That's what they'd be doing. What they're doing, particularly Turki Alalsheikh, is pouring money into the top end of the sport, sort of exacerbating the inequities in the sport from those at the very top of the totem pole to those at the very bottom, while once again doing an end run against those who might point out these flaws and these criticisms, and just simply supporting those who will just say, hey, Turkey, man, what a guy. What a fantastic job he's doing for boxing. Everything I think that critics like us said was going to happen with Saudi investment in boxing and Saudi dominance is happening. Including what we thought would happen when they took over the ring. And as Eric said, the fact that boxing scene can't get anywhere near one of these events to report on it because it's been critical of Turki Alalsheikh, I think is sort of representative of where we are. And look, there are a lot of people who just don't care. They just want to see people punch each other in the head, and they don't care about anything else. And if you're one of the people who's punching other people in the head, you want to get as well paid for that as possible. So I don't blame any of the fighters involved for any kind of involvement in any of this. But stop acting like it's some great thing for the sport or some great thing for the business, or Turki Alalsheikh or Dana White are good people. Good Lord, they're not. They're dreadful human beings, and that's probably why they're really interested in boxing.
A little bit there.
Yeah, see, Kieran doesn't tap dance like I do, and I think it speaks it speaks a little bit to the fact that I'm still trying to exist and survive in this business a little bit, and Kieran is fully checked out.
How does that cat in the background survive, Kieran? But he's just nice, or she is just nice. You know what it really appears? It appears that all of us want to be on the. I've always prided myself in this. And I've made mistakes, and I never make the same mistake twice, though, because I make too many new ones. But I want to end up on the right side of history. I think all of us do. And I'll just get your quick opinions, and I'll let Lee go the rest of the way here with broadcasting, because that's how I came into this as a broadcaster. I've called thousands of fights on television, every single role, blow-by-blow, play-by-play, a roving reporter, and I absolutely... And I won't mention names because a lot of them I like as human beings. But broadcasting now, and again, I get into the event things. I loved it when it was myself and an Al Bernstein, or myself and a Nick Charles, or myself and whatever. Now you got 75 broadcasters on every frickin' event, I'm going to call it. and most of them can't spell boxing. Even if you give them the BOX and a G, they can't spell it. Some know a little tiny bit, but then they're more concerned about, I can't do it because I don't want to lose my voice, but they scream, and care. It's, to me, that side of it, and you guys have all done that in some way. You've been on camera and stuff like that. Does it bother you, or do you see that, or is it just Smitty?
And there's definitely too many broadcasters on a lot of these shows. When you've got 3 guys at ringside, which is arguably already one more than you need, but okay, we're used to that at this point. And then they cut up to the desk where there's 4 people sitting there, and then the B desk with another 3 people. It's a little much. The screamers. I'm not going to name any names, but I'm famous for falling asleep during fights that come on a little too late. I have actually undiagnosed mild narcolepsy, and There was one incident last year where I actually was fully awoken from my slumber by the blow-by-blow man going nuts at a knockout, and it was, I'm just trying to catch some Z's here, but that approach, the need to scream, I'm not a fan of that side of of where boxing broadcasting has gone. I still think there are some good analysts out there and some teams that work well together. Not everybody annoys me, but are there more people annoying me now than might have been the case when I first started? Most certainly. And actually, just to to make it about you, Smitty, I was watching one of your old fights recently. I wrote. I wrote not one of your fights you were in, but one that you were calling. I wrote about Sumaya Anani and I rewatched her upset of Christy Martin, and there you were on the broadcast, part of the call for that fight back in a simpler time when not everyone had to scream at the top of their lungs during a broadcast.
Working with my good friend, Colonel Bob Sheridan, who I grew up with. All right, Lee, take us home with this. Get us out of this thing. Even though it's great, I'd like to go another hour, but go ahead.
Well, let's lighten this up a little bit. We've been going pretty heavy the last few minutes, so let's lighten this up a little bit. Could you tell us who is your favorite all-time fighter and why?
Go first, Kieran.
Sure. All time is tricky. While I've been doing boxing, I will say that my favorite has been Miguel Cotto. And that was partly because he was the first fighter who I kind of followed from ringside from very early in his career through to retirement. So there was an element of that. I just always really liked the way he went about his business in the ring. I just loved that whole kind of no nonsense approach, and I liked that same approach that he had out of the ring. Right, he never said anything that didn't need to be said. He certainly wasn't a shouter or a screamer. He was more likely to be just walk on past. But I always really enjoyed Cotto, and the fact that he would always bring it. He was very rarely in a boring fight, and I just always thought that he brought a certain class to how he went about his business. And is he my all-time favorite? Gosh, there have been so many throughout, history that I've always really enjoyed watching. But Cotto has a very special place in my heart because of being able to sort of follow him all the way through and then be in his camp for his final fight, which was a real honor as well.
Mm-hmm. Eric?
For me, it's and this is tied into the years that I started covering boxing. Again, started in '97, so I didn't have like a childhood favorite before that. And then I would say my peak years of fandom were those first 5 or 10 years that I was covering it before I became started getting old and crusty. So knowing that we're focusing on that time period, easily for me, it's Mickey Ward. It was his fight with Reggie Green in particular, kind of was on ESPN Friday Night Fights. Unbelievable comeback where he's bleeding through a giant hole in his lower lip and knocks him out in the last round. That kind of got me on board the train, and then from there, I just something about his warrior spirit just absolutely captivated me. Him banging the gloves together, asking for more, no matter how much of a beating he was taking. And I was lucky enough to be ringside for all three of the Gaddy fights. And then to have met Mickey a few times, interviewed him a few times, and find out he's just as charming a person as he was a fighter. For me, it's Mickey Ward.
Two of the great examples of why I call him the most common yet uncommon of all men. You got the cerebralness of Cotto, and then you got Mickey, who can relate to anybody until you get in the ring with him, and then it's a little different kettle of fish. Go ahead, Lee.
Final question. What is the best fight that you've ever watched?
So I know my answer and Kieran's answer. I'll give you mine first because it transitions very easily off what I was just talking about. Being ringside at Ward Gaddy 1, for me that stands out above all the rest. And there are other fights in history that may compare that I wasn't ringside for, and so that tips the scales in the favor. The fact that I was 15, 20 feet away from the action for one of the greatest fights of all time really makes it stand out. Certainly the best round I've ever seen, round 9, and just being that atmosphere, that war between those two guys who, going in, I considered them the two most consistently entertaining, exciting fighters in the world, and here they were going to be in the same ring at the same time. Well, how can this miss? And so, to sort of borrow what Emmanuel Stewart said, we knew it was going to be special, and it's even more incredible than we imagined. That's what we got that night. I know I butchered Emmanuel's words, and I was paraphrasing and not correctly quoting. But yeah, for me, it's Ward Gaddy, and had I been at the fight that Kieran's about to tell you about, it might have been that, but I wasn't at that one. So for me, it's Ward Gaddy.
Yeah, it was pretty good. But for me, yeah, I was very fortunate to be ringside for Diego Corrales, Jose Luis Castillo, and that was a ridiculous fight, period, and a ridiculous fight to be ringside for. And what made it extra special for me is I was sitting next to Bud Schulberg, and to be at that most incredible of fights, and I knew Diego a little bit, and I knew Joe Goosen a little bit at that stage. And to be there watching it with Bud freaking Schulberg as the added kind of element to it, that was a remarkable experience. And the fact that there were very few people in the arena. Smitty, were you at that fight? You must have been at that fight.
I was there.
Yeah, I figured. And I was only like, 4,000 people in the arena. And I'm sure now, as I would joke quite often on Eric and my podcast, that with the number of people who I'm sure insist they were there now, there were probably 250,000 people there on that night. But that, for me, was particularly, obviously, that ridiculous 10th round. But just generally, that whole slow burn of that fight, that was an amazing experience for me.
Yeah, the ebbs and flows and highs and lows. And what you said, you're making me think of something. I don't want to end on a down note, but Diego became a great friend of mine. And did a couple of shows with me, and a fantastic in-ring at Johnny Taco's here in Las Vegas. And I was with him about a week before his death. And you talk about how this sport, and that was a sport, that was a fight and a sport all in one, but how these guys at the highest level really, Diego was never the same after that fight. Neither Castillo, just much like my buddy Ali was never the same after that first fight with Joe Frazier, fought on. But I just think that that's why I take it so damn serious, boxing, and why you two have both been such a credit and are a credit. And my concern, my fear is that where will the next Raskins and Mulvaneys come from? As I'll I make it. I need some wine is what I need now, and maybe a gummy. But finish this off. Anything else? I need to go. How does a polar bear compare to a great fighter? Maybe you can answer that. What characteristics do they have in common? The polar bear and a great fighter.
Well, polar bears.
Not for you, Raskin. It's for Mulvaney.
Right. No, I'm laying back on this one.
Goes off on a 15-minute answer because he's been looking into this deeply. Interestingly, polar bears, like a lot of predators, are actually quite risk averse. So I think they'd be counterpunchers, right? They'll wait for their opportunity. They'll wait, and then they'll strike, and then it'll be over in a second. It would be one of those fights that the crowd is booing because nothing's happening for 10 rounds, and then one fighter gets his head bitten off.
So are you saying Chuck Wepner was better off fighting the type of bear he did rather than a polar bear?
Yeah, see, polar bears by and large against unarmed human beings. In fact, I can leave the by and large. Polar bears versus unarmed human beings, undefeated, baby, undefeated.
Well, I hope both of you at least will are you guys coming to Canastota in a few months? Or
Yes, I certainly am.
That is the plan.
Awesome.
Yeah, I'm planning to as well.
Well,
yeah.
Fantastic. And perhaps do you either one of you think you'll ever do the podcast again?
I think if we had a chance, we would. And we
Right.
try to keep it going post Showtime, but
Right.
I mean, not that we need to tell you guys, but apparently money doesn't fall out of the skies if you're an independent boxing podcast. Who knew? But so that was a fact. But I think, I think we really enjoyed doing podcasting together. And I think people like listening to us, mostly because we spent half our time talking about stuff other than boxing and entertaining each other immensely. I'd love to do it again with Eric, and hope he says the same thing.
Any final words?
I would certainly do it again as well, as long as there is money to make it worth my while, and that money is not coming direct from Turki Alalsheikh. I think Kieran and I are on the same page about that one.
Exactly.
Lee, any final words for Kieran, Eric?
My final words is thank you. Thank you for being on the podcast today. It was a very enjoyable conversation, and hope we can do it again sometime.
You see, there are guys left in boxing who have the sagation, perspication, and sapience of yours truly. We know Lee has it. Kieran Mulvaney